This is the Giant Mouse GM11. Now, this is going to be more of a first impressions. As anybody who knows about this knife knows, this knife only came out last week. I'm putting up this video now with less time with the knife than my typical reviews for two reasons. One, this knife is just out, it's sold out, but it's coming around on the secondary market pretty regularly, and it does seem to be selling for just about MSRP, so you're not paying scalper prices if you want to get one. And second, it just happens to be something that people are paying attention to right now. So if you're interested in this knife, if you've seen it on Instagram, you've seen people talking about it, just want to give some initial impressions on what it's like, what it feels like, what's good about it, what's bad about it, just from spending a little bit of time with it. And to be clear, this knife got to me earlier today. I basically spent today with it. I've used it on some cutting tasks. I've carried it around a little bit, played with it a bunch. So it doesn't have the sort of more extensive use that I tend to put into my knives, but I do have a pretty good sense already of what this knife is going to be good at and bad at and who it's really for. So, right up front, this is from Giant Mouse's GM line. Giant Mouse has two lines. Their more well-known and more common knives are from their Ace line, like this one here, the Ace Rio. Ace line knives tend to be priced in the $150 to $250 range generally, and they are made of usually micarta or G10. Occasionally you get some brass, some titanium, things like that. And these are made in high production numbers, many hundreds to thousands of knives, and they're generally not limited. They will be discontinued, but they're not limited. The GM line, on the other hand, is what Giant Mouse generally uses to debut new knife designs, where they will first make a limited run in the GM line, which is 400 of what is a satin and titanium version, usually with either brass or copper accents, plus 200 of a darker version, the GM11 or GMPX or whatever it is, that is 200. So 600 limited edition ones. Same factories, so this is made in Italy at almost certainly the exact same factory as the Rio. Handles tend to be, in fact, I think they always are, titanium. More details with things like milling lines. Same blade steels, about the same grind. So really what you're paying for, this is a $385 knife retail. And what you're paying for in the basically $200 difference between something in the GM line or something in the GM line versus something in the Ace line is you're paying for a titanium handle rather than a either synthetic or micarta handle. I guess micarta is a synthetic. You're paying for sometimes some more complicated milling patterns and a little bit more complicated design. You know, things like the way they do these lanyard cutouts, sometimes the patterns on the handle scale, stuff like that, will be a little bit more complicated. And you're paying for the fact that it's limited. That there are 400 of these in existence, and there are probably many hundreds more to thousands of these in existence. So, with that in mind, this review also really serves two purposes, or first impressions really serves two purposes looking at this knife. The first thing to say up front is if you like this knife, you like the way it looks, and you don't want to drop $385 on a titanium version of this, then wait. Because almost every knife that Giant Mouse has done in the GM line, they have subsequently brought over to their Ace line at that $150 to $250 price point. This, I am guessing, will not be an exception. So if you like the way this looks and you like some of the things that I say about it and some of my impressions about it, but you don't want to drop that kind of money, I would say in probably 9 months to a year, you will probably see Giant Mouse come out with an Ace line version with a very similar design. The most recent one they did that with was the Giant Mouse 8, which turned into the Ace Jagd. They're sort of hunting, their first of the two hunting knives they came out with. I think the only one I can think of as a GM that hasn't come out at some point in the Ace line was the GM9. And frankly, since that's one of the more recent ones, it might still come out. But anyway, back to this knife that's right in front of us. So this is a $385 Giant Mouse made in Italy. Magna Cup blade, though their GM line blades are totally sterile. There's no giant mouse logo. There's no steel marking, and I don't think there's a steel marking anywhere, even on the Ting or anything like that. The only branding that or the only marking you have is inside the backspacer here, where you see the number. This is number 74 out of 400. Just to get through the fit and finish details here, this is made in Italy. That is where they do most, maybe, no, not all, but most of their GM line. And what you've got here is a sheep's foot blade with a very low tip. You know, they describe this in their marketing as, you know, sort of with that nautical inspiration, very much from where the sheep's foot design came from, with a relatively low saber grind. So you got a flat that goes all the way out here with a very nice swedge that keeps your tip pretty nice and pointy, and relatively thin blade stock. This is 118 thousandths blade stock, which is thinner than Giant Mouse goes a lot of the time. Giant Mouse will tend to, with knives like, let's see, do I have my... So let's say the Corda isn't a great example, but it's decent. You know, something like the Corda, what they will tend to do is have thicker blade stock with a pretty aggressive or tall grind that comes down thinner behind the edge just because of the height of the grind. There we go. Great example here is the Nimbus. So the Nimbus has thicker stock, but it has the full flat grind, so it comes down to a slicier edge. This one has a saber grind, and it keeps most of that thickness most of the way out, but because that stock is thinner, you end up with a very nice cutting edge. This is a very slicey blade right out of the box. And because of the way they do this, this belt satin, which almost ends up looking like a stone wash because it's so sort of even, you get that and it's a very gradual transition from the top of this flat grind up to the flat here. It passes through material very, very easily. And that's really actually where this knife has shined so far in use, because you've got this relatively thin blade stock, because you've got this low tip, you've got a full belly here, and it is plenty sharp enough. This is a really nice utility blade. This is a really nice EDC blade. For your cuts where you're going down on a table, for the cuts where you're pulling through something, very easy to locate the tip of this knife wherever you want it to, and to just get it right into that material and cut through, pull through, whatever you need to do. And if you're passing this through cardboard, this is a very good knife for breaking down cardboard, and for things like that, you know, drywall, stuff like that, where you're passing through an abrasive material. Because this blade stock is thin, the finishing is very slick and smooth, and so as the knife pushes through, you will face very little resistance. It parts the material very easily. So this blade has been a very good user blade, again, in my limited experience with it. The blade shape, the greatest similarity you're going to find somewhere else in the market is if you've had an Olemic whippersnapper. One of the whippersnapper blades is very similar to this in shape and in function. This one's obviously a little bit bigger than that, but it's just very nicely done, very functional, and looks very nice. It's very distinctive. You've got Giant Mouse's typical jimping a bit further up the spine here, which gives you, as always, a really nice place to anchor your thumb. You can press down on the blade very easily, push it through material very easily. It works very well. You know, frankly, more designers should start looking at this, though I think a lot of designers sort of consider this Vox's signature by this point, doing the jimping up here. Your opening hole, which is Giant Mouse's signature triangular design, works very nicely. They've integrated it very elegantly into the handle here, where this cutout here aligns perfectly with your opening hole, and you get tons of access when you want to roll this out. Thumb nestles nicely in there. It's positioned very nicely relative to the pivot. You can get your thumb right in there, and it works great as a flicker, and you can reverse flick it if you want to. Your middle finger can get right in that spot there, and I am not a good reverse flicker, but I can manage to reverse flick this one. But it works, in my experience, most nicely as just a slow roller. Get at the bottom of this triangle, roll it out. It's just a very nice experience. This is on bearings, not washers, and so you do have that bearing feel where rather than being smooth, it's more just, it feels like it's rolling. And the fact is, if you've got a titanium frame, and yeah, this is a frame lock, by the way, titanium frame lock on bearings with decent manufacturing, it's going to be smooth. It's going to drop shut. That's not impressive in 2024. That's kind of par for the course, but this meets that par. So very good, useful blade. So now let's go on to the handles. Handles here have this relatively complex, it's kind of like, if you've seen the Spyderco Drunken, the drunken milling pattern from Sinkovich on there, where it's this wavy pattern, and this whole handle is contoured the entire way through, down to very thin edges at the bottom of the titanium here. It's a little bit thicker in the middle, but it's a very aggressive contour. And you see it around the pivot here. The contouring, you know, meets up to the pivot, so you get a little bit of extra dimension right there. The fit and finish is very good overall. Nice little chamfer all the way around. As Italy tends to do, everything is rounded off on this knife. Your spine is crowned. Your edges are crowned. Your backspacer is independently crowned of the scales. So you can see it's rounded there. And if you look closely, you can see there's sort of three different roundings here, where the backspacer is rounded and then each scale is rounded independently of the backspacer. You got some extra little facets back here. There's just lots of extra little facets and details the closer you look. And, you know, again, I'm spending more time on this sort of fit and finish than I typically do because this is a $400 knife that is really more of a collector's piece than a user. The way they did the access to the lock bar is similarly elegant more than it is functional, rather than, actually it's very similar, now that I think about it, it is very similar to what they did on the Nimbus here, where rather than putting, say, jimping, like I think they did this on the Corda. Yeah, rather than like what they do on the Corda, which is what most knives do, which is basically jimp the lock bar access to make it grippy. Instead, they basically milled a bunch of little domes in, which works just fine. It's easy enough to access this lock bar. There is a little bit of lock stick when you first get this knife, at least in my experience, but it goes away pretty quickly. Very easy to open, very easy to close, tons of lock bar access there. The relief for the liner lock here is very small, and there's not a ton of lock bar tension. It's pretty easy to disengage, pretty easy to, and it's not that it's a unsafe lockup, but this isn't a bank vault lockup. It doesn't sound like a bank vault lockup. It doesn't feel like it. Again, it's the way the Italians tend to make their knives. They tend to have lighter lockups. It's been plenty secure in my experience, but that's just sort of the way it's being made. Perfectly functional frame lock, deep carry clip back here, and then as always, Giant Mouse does a really good job with their backspacers. You got a brass backspacer here with a little hole cut out to show that backspacer, which is really more of a lanyard hole right there. It's just very nicely designed, very nicely machined, very pretty. It's a very pretty object. And there is a lot of complexity in the machining here. Now, how does it actually function? So this handle is very neutral, but still does have that overall curve downward. It isn't a straight handle. It does bow down toward the back. And in hand, with smaller hands, it works very well. You can basically I can fit 4 fingers very safely on here. And this ends up being a very natural grip, where there's really nothing forcing my fingers to be anywhere in particular on either the front or the back of this handle, but the fact that it curves down a little bit does keep my hands a little bit more secure. And really what's doing a lot of the work is this contouring. So it rolls very nicely into my hand because, again, this contour, this roll here is rolling right into my palm. My fingers are wrapping right around here. This titanium does provide a little bit of texture. And then with this knife, even more than most giant mouses, this jimping up here ends up doing a lot of the work in keeping the knife secure while I'm using it. This is really, I mean, I could pinch up on this, but this doesn't feel as good to pinch up on as a lot of other giant mics. You can sort of stick your thumb in this thumb hole and get a grip there, but it's just this handle is too neutral to, again, if I pull out my Nimbus here, the Nimbus, you've got a really secure spot for your hand. This big fat choil is putting your hand there, and so my hand feels secure. Even if my thumb were to go away, my hand feels secure on this handle. The GM11 is a more neutral handle. It's a thinner handle. I'll get to that in a second. But because it is more neutral, it can move pretty easily in my hand, but once I lock down on that jimping with my thumb, it feels very secure. And so this grip works really well with this knife. And if you need to, you can, say you're just opening a box, using something where you're not using that much force, you can sort of put your finger into this little choil here, get up on the tip, and do your drag cuts, your pull cuts just like that. That also works really well. So this handle ends up being very comfortable because of all that contouring, but less secure in the hand than a lot of the designs that Giant Mouse typically puts out. So it's just different from what Giant Mouse does. Giant Mouse, to get another example here, if you look at one of their older designs, the Biblio here. Giant Mouse tends to make knives with big curves that tell your hand exactly where it should be. And they feel great in that position or in any one of those positions if there's multiple. They feel very secure, but obviously that means they sometimes can be a little bit less comfortable, especially if your hands aren't the right size. This is a very different design philosophy. There's a more gradual, gentler curve that is sort of nudging your hand into the right space without holding it there. Now, in terms of tasks, this has been very good for everything that I've used it for. I already mentioned this blade shape is really, really nice for your general EDC tasks, for boxes, for cutting twine, for, I've done a little bit of light gardening with it, stuff like that. For your lighter duty tasks, having a very low tip like this, where the tip is basically, even with your knuckles, well below the pivot. With all this belly, this is a traditional sheep's foot, and sheep's foots are great for EDC tasks for a reason. People like them for a reason. You combine that with thin blade stock, this is a very, very good utility knife. With a handle this neutral, if you start to use it for more extended tasks, you're going to start feeling a little bit more of that hand fatigue, because with a neutral handle like this, you're going to have to grip it harder to maintain the knife where you want it to be in your hand. But the real sort of utilitarian value of this knife, the thing that is surprisingly great about it, is its size. This knife is very thin. If I fold this up and I bring out my Delica, this knife is only slightly thicker than the Spyderco Delica, and it is about the same size as a Delica. But then you pull this out, and you feel it's not actually that much longer if you were to measure it, but this feels like a way bigger knife when it is pulled out than something like the Delica. And that's the surprisingly excellent thing about this GM11 design, is you fold this up, and this is something that might not come across in the pictures that Giant Mouse uses to advertise. You fold this up, this is a small knife in the pocket. This is a thin knife in the pocket. It's not light, but it's not heavy either. It's about 3.1 ounces, I think it is. Let me see if I can get some other small knives out here. If I compare this to your Riv, which is a tiny knife, this is not that much bigger than your Giant Mouse Riv. Let's see if I compare it to a large Sebenza. The large Sebenza dwarfs this one. It looks a lot bigger. It's just a little bit longer, but it just looks bigger. This knife carries very, very small. And because it is so thin and because it's contoured like that, you basically don't feel this at all in your pocket. And so what this ends up being really good at is it's a really, really strong, lightweight EDC. This knife is thin. This knife is easy to carry. This knife is nice. It feels premium. It feels well machined. This blade shape is awesome for all of the tasks you would want a lightweight EDC to do. And the fact is, this handle, while it's not really a great handle for heavier duty stuff, that isn't really what you'd be using this knife for anyway. Actually, here we go. Small and cozy. One more size comparison here. It's about this. It's only a little bit bigger than the small and cozy, which is a very small knife from Chris Reeve. So this ends up feeling very compact, very small, very easy to carry. One of those knives that sort of disappears in the pocket, that ends up having a lot of utility with its blade. And in that sense, it really feels like an evolution and part of the continued evolution of Giant Mouse's design philosophy into ever more practical and useful designs. And I'll be talking about this in some of my other Giant Mouse reviews. But one of the sort of trends with Giant Mouse, particularly over the last year or so, is if you look at their old designs. I'll pull out the Biblio here, and I'll pull out the Nimbus here. These are knives that are great for what they do, but they come with an asterisk. This thing, the ergonomics and the blade shape for small EDC tasks are very hard to beat. It's really, really good at those, but it is huge and chunky and heavy in the pocket, and frankly, it's very expensive for the level of fit and finish you get. The Nimbus, same sort of thing. This is a big, chunky knife. Now, the benefit is that it feels wonderful in the hand, especially as you push it harder, but this thing is freaking huge in the pocket for how big a knife it is. When they came out with the Corta, you started to see them slim things down. Now, obviously, they're going to re-offer this one, but you started seeing this in other knives like the Rio as well, where rather than having big, fat steel liners with micarta on top, they started to nest the liners. They started to make things a little lighter. Rather than this being, like a 4-ounce knife, this is more like a 3-ounce knife. And they've continued doing that, especially with their designs over late 2022 and 2023. And so now what we have with Giant Mouse and the GM11 is just a really nice lightweight EDC. This blade cuts great, this handle is easy to grasp, feels really nice in the hand, and it is very nicely done. But really, it's just so small and light and just pleasant. It's a very nice object you have in the pocket that, unlike a lot of other premium knives, you're actually going to really enjoy using when you actually have to pull it out. So I will say, again, this is a first impression. I have not spent that much time with this knife, but my first impression with the GM11 has been a lot more positive than I expected. I got this knife really because for 2 reasons. One, I knew that if I didn't like it, I could sell it for exactly what I paid. And 2, because I really wanted to see in 2024 what was the difference between Giant Mouse's GM line and the stuff that is just coming out of their Ace line. Again, $200 difference roughly between these two knives. The obvious difference is the titanium. This is contoured titanium and this is limited. This is micarta and this is not limited. But I mean, it's still, put another way, this one is twice the price of this one. And while, we can debate all day whether any knife is worth $385, you can certainly see if this knife is $200, which everything Giant Mouse is a little bit overpriced. But if this knife is $200, you can see why this one is almost $400. You can see the differences in the level of complexity in the scale designs. You can see it in the milling patterns, and you can see it in the fact that this is all titanium. You put the fact that this is limited, say that's worth $50, and I can get to $385 for this if you're starting from $200 and change for this one. But more than just being a well-done $385 knife, and again, especially in a world where that is not as ridiculous a price as it used to be, this is just a really good EDC, and this is immediately seeming like one of Giant Mouse's very best EDC designs. If you do want a knife that is your office carry, or that is something that you're just carrying around every day that you don't expect to be using hard, and you want just to do boxes, to do small tasks, you could do food prep with this, all the stuff that a little sheep's foot is good with, this is a knife that you should really think about in the same headspace as your Delica. This is a knife that is about It's a little bit heavier, but it's still light. It's almost the exact same size. It's almost the exact same size in the pocket. It feels about as small in the pocket. And it is, if anything, significantly more capable than the Delica. Blade cuts about as well, is thicker, and it's Magna cut, so it's going to be tougher to boot. So that's my impression. That's my initial impression of the Giant Mouse GM11, which is a lot more positive than I expected. So I'll probably continue to carry this one a little bit more. I may put up a full review later. I might just do it in a bunch of shorts. We shall see if I come to conclusions they're different than these initial ones, but I'm feeling pretty strong about these initial ones so far. It's pretty clear what Giant Mouse was designing for, and I think they succeeded at a lot of what they were trying to do here. This is fun, this is fidgety, this is well made, and it's very useful on top of that. And that's the great thing about Giant Mouse. Their stuff can be quite overpriced. Their stuff, especially their older designs, can be clunky. It can be chunky. It can be questionable in terms of fit and finish, but their design chops have always been up there. And at this price point, at this level, and as their designs evolve, they're starting to sand off some of those rough edges, and this ends up being a very, very good knife. I would say in particular, if you're the sort of person that is used to spending $300 to $400 on Chinese-made knives, things like that, if you're the person who likes those fast, fidgety actions, you like your knives on bearings and stuff like that, this is a hell of a lot more interesting and a hell of a lot more useful than just about anything that Riot or We has made in the past year. And that includes all the collaborations. If you're telling me if I'm picking between another Chavez, I got nothing against Chavez, but he's been making the same knife for 6 years now. If I'm picking between another Chavez and this guy, this is way more interesting. There's a lot more going on, and it's probably a lot more useful in your day-to-day. So yeah, if you're the sort of person that is interested in dropping $385 on a titanium pocket knife and you see one of these on the secondary, give it a shot. You might be impressed just like I was. Those are my thoughts on the Giant Mouse GM11. Drop any comments below. Would love to know your thoughts, and I hope you found this to be a good use of your time. I'll see you again soon.